Hello and welcome to this workshop webinar on supporting strong emotions, a neuroaffirmative approach for parents of children and teenagers who experience the world differently. This workshop webinar is brought to you by the HSC Psychology Services across Carlow, Kilkenny. And before we start, just to let you know that you can pause this webinar at any stage and watch it in your own time. You can rewind and watch it again if you like. If you are going to pause the webinar, each new section is marked by a blue slide, such as the one on your screen right now. So that might be a good place to pause if you need to. So let's get started. So the objectives of the webinar today are about learning about a neuroaffirmative approach to supporting children and young people, exploring why children with thinking and learning differences find it challenging to express and manage their emotions. We'll learn a little bit about overwhelm, meltdowns and shutdowns, and we'll talk about strategies to support self-regulation and emotional well-being. Before we move on to the next slide, I just want to comment on the symbol that's at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. This is the rainbow-coloured infinity symbol, which is the preferred symbol of the autistic community, and this represents the diversity of autism as well as the greater neurodiversity movement. So, neuroaffirmative approach to supporting children and young people. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about neurodiversity, what this is and what this means. So just like we have in nature where we have biodiversity, which means we've got all different types of plants, animals, creatures, in the human world we have neurodiversity, which means there are very many different types of brains or neurotypes. So you can see in this poster here, it represents this where it talks about the diversity that we have in the animal world. We also have a diversity of people. And then finally, we've got a diversity of human brains. So all different types of human brains. No two brains are alike. And we have names for different brains like ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, and so on. And we need all of these different types of brains within society in order to be successful as a human race. Just like in biodiversity, we need all of the different types of animals, plants, and organisms. So what do we mean by a neuroaffirmative approach? It's very important that we have an individualized approach for each of our children. So children are all unique individuals who need an individualized approach. Each child is going to have different sensory needs and a different level of tolerance for demands that they might encounter. This is particularly important if you have children with different neurotypes in your household, so differently wired brains and different needs. Such as, more than one child with different needs in your household, it becomes particularly important then to think about an individualized approach for each child and what their own needs are. The principles of a neuroaffirmative ability-based approach are about enhancing well-being, someone's ability and their success, creating positive emotional memories where we can, fostering communication, and it's really important that this is in line with your child's communication preferences. Lots of children don't communicate verbally, and they may communicate in other ways. So just to note that in line with your child's communication preferences, it's a good idea to foster how they're communicating. Also fostering self-awareness and self-expression. And then it's really all very much about supporting children and young people to thrive. So this is a little bit of reframing from some of the more negative problem-focused terms that we often talk about, and just a different way of thinking about those things. So reframing them slightly more positively and looking at the positive side of some of these so-called negative traits. So starting with bossy could be considered, you could consider somebody as being a natural leader, a manager or a director. Defiant, a person who's defiant could be thought about as holding strong beliefs, being bold or determined. Somebody who's considered demanding might also be considered as knowing what they want and being outspoken. Dramatic could be reframed as being expressive and passionate. Fearful could be reframed as being cautious, careful, protective. Fussy, you might think about that as somebody who has strong preferences. Hyperactive could be thought about as somebody who is energetic, enthusiastic, on the go. Impulsive could be reconsidered as somebody who's spontaneous or instinctive. Inflexible, somebody who prefers order and predictability. Oppositional, a person who advocates for a different perspective. Stubborn, persistent, tenacious, and steadfast might be another way of thinking about a stubborn individual. Talkative could be reframed as somebody who enjoys communicating and is articulate. A tattletale might be reframed as somebody who seeks justice and respects the rules. And then unfocused could be thought about as somebody who can multitask and who pays attention to many things. And a phrase we hear a lot of is referring to somebody as just wanting attention. And a way to reframe that might be around thinking of somebody as seeking connection with other people. So it's just to highlight that there are often very negative terms that are attached to children and young people, and it's just to encourage everyone to think about another way of looking at that, or a different lens that you can look at that. So what is the UPR framework? So this is a framework that we often use to help us understand behavior and strong emotions. So there's 3 elements to a UPR framework. Firstly, understanding, the U. So this is understanding what my role is as a parent, the person, so my child or my young person, their behaviors, what they are, what causes them, and what contributes to them. So what might trigger a behavior or what might cause a behavior. The P refers to be preventing, so being proactive. Are there things that we can do to maybe prevent or make it less likely that a behavior or a strong emotion might happen? And this is really all about supporting somebody's regulation, so balancing their needs. The or then is about responding. So what do I do if a behavior or a strong emotion is happening? How do I deal with this? How do I manage overwhelm as it occurs? So this is the UPR of supporting strong emotions. And the idea of this is if we're doing much more within the understanding, the U, and within the preventing, the P, that hopefully we don't always get to that point of needing the or, needing to respond, that our aim is to try and avoid getting to that place. So this is an overview of what this is going to look like, so the plan around this. So within the understanding, as I said, we're talking about your role as a parent, your child and their particular neurotype, so understanding that and what that means. The environment that your child is in, so not just home but school also, and any other environments that they're in. Your own child's behaviours and their communication, their preferences for communication, how they best communicate, how they would prefer you to communicate with them. So understanding all of that. And then also understanding our own expectations of our children and their skill level. Then in the preventing column, we're thinking about being proactive. So what is it that we need to teach or focus on? So self-advocacy is a very important one. So supporting your child to communicate what they need. Strategies to support self-regulation. So what are the tools and the strategies that we can look at that can help our child to manage their regulation needs better, so their emotion and their sensory needs. Teaching new skills, is there anything that we need to support our child to learn about that might help in terms of managing strong emotions and behaviours? And thinking about engaging activities also. And then in the responding column, it's really about that plan for what to do when your child is feeling overwhelmed. So hopefully it's clear from this that really behavior or strong emotions and overwhelm, those things are a consequence of being very overwhelmed and the stressors building up. So by the time this happens, it's almost too late. And really what it's about is supporting your child's regulation and their getting their emotional needs balanced, getting their sensory needs balanced, so that we're not getting to that point of overwhelm. So why is it challenging for some to express and manage emotions? So let's think about neurology for a moment. So we know that the brain connections for some children are organized differently. And we know this from neuroimaging studies, which show that the structural and functional differences in a part of the brain that's called the amygdala. So this is part of the brain that's responsible for emotions. And in autistic children, this is functionally very different than it is in non-autistic children. So we know that this is connected differently and wired differently. These neuroimaging studies also show us that there are differences in the connections between the amygdala and a part of the brain, which is the frontal lobes. In this little image here, it's the red section of the brain, the frontal lobes. So the connections between the amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for emotions, understanding them and experiencing them, and the part with the frontal lobes, which is responsible for organizing and decision making and planning. And where those connections are different, it means that there's less capacity often for problem solving. So feeling an emotion and figuring out how to deal with it, the connections are different for lots of children between those two areas of the brain, which can make it more difficult for them to identify solutions to problems when they're feeling very strong in their emotions. In terms of recognizing emotions, some children find it much harder to recognize the signs of emotions in others. So, understanding and recognizing other people's facial expressions, the tone of their voice, or another person's body language. And some people can experience lots of empathy with others. So, empathy being the ability to understand and share other people's feelings. And some people can absorb other feelings and experience them incredibly intensely. So there's a huge variation in terms of children who think and experience the world differently and how they experience emotions. Some children really struggle to identify emotions in others and in themselves, and other people are the other side of that coin and they experience them overly intensely and almost absorb them. So identifying with other people's emotions, as I said just a moment ago, some children have highly developed empathy skills, or what we call empathy over arousal. So they're overly attuned to other people's emotions. And this can lead them to experience the emotional state of others to a very heightened extent, so fully absorbing another person's emotions. And sometimes a child can be very upset by this, overly upset by this, because they're experiencing it so strongly. One person said that it's like walking around with no skin on. I feel everything so keenly. So alexithymia is described as a difficulty in understanding and identifying your own emotions. And this could be thought of as a difficulty in converting what you think into your emotions, or what you think and what your emotions are. So what you feel, what you think and what you feel, into speech. So communicating that verbally. People who have high levels of alexithymia might be aware that they are experiencing an emotion, but they're not quite sure what that emotion is. So they know there's an emotion there, but they really struggle to identify it, to communicate it, to express it, to manage it. So not being able to identify and express emotions can make it really, really challenging to manage them. And people really, really struggle with this. Approximately 10% of the population experience alexithymia, and approximately 50% of autistic individuals experience it. So autistic people who do not experience alexithymia have typical levels of empathy. So it is one of the biggest myths about autism that autistic people don't experience empathy. That is simply not true. However, lots of autistic people experience alexithymia, which does interfere with their ability to understand their emotions and that of others. So autism is not associated with a lack of empathy, but alexithymia is. So those who experience alexithymia still care very deeply about other people's feelings and can experience distress in response to other people's feelings, but they can sometimes find it very challenging to respond to that. I'd hoped to be able to show you a video clip as part of today's webinar, but unfortunately there are technical difficulties at the moment, which means I can't show you this clip. So I would invite you to pause the webinar where we are right now, and please take a look at this clip on YouTube. So this is a clip that explains all about alexithymia and what it's like to not know how you feel. And this is by a person who has a YouTube channel who goes by Yosemite Sam. And you might have come across her before. She's an autistic adult who explains a lot about the experience of autistic people. So she's done this really nice clip on alexithymia. So the link is there in the slide on your screen right now, but you could also go into YouTube and type in alexithymia, what it's like to not know how you feel, and you'll get a better insight into what we're talking about here. So please pause the video now and go and watch that clip. So in the video clip you just watched, this emotions wheel was just referred to, and I just wanted to include it in this webinar just to demonstrate the huge complexity of emotions that are out there. The inner wheel, which has the smaller number of emotions, anger, fear, feeling bad, surprised, happy, sad, and disgusted, is quite often the level of emotional understanding that many of our children and young people might be at. And then for others, they have a broader sense of emotions. So I just wanted to put this up so we could take a look at that in more detail. The double empathy problem is something that's really important to be aware of if your child is autistic. This is a theory that was designed by a guy called Damien Milton, and it's really important in understanding why managing emotional experiences might be challenging for autistic people, but also why it's difficult for us non-autistic people, if you are a non-autistic person, to understand that. So essentially what this is referring to, as we see on the cartoon here on the screen, so the autistic person is on the left and they might struggle to read between the lines, overcome other people's misconceptions about autism, or manage sensory distractions. And if we look at the non-autistic person on the right, they might struggle to form positive first impressions of somebody else, to recognize and understand autism, and to imagine autistic sensory difficulties. So the theory of the double empathy problem is this part in the middle, that both sides might struggle to understand each other's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and differences. So up until relatively recently, this was considered as an issue that an autistic person might have, that they are not understanding non-autistic people and non-autistic ways of expressing emotions and understanding those. But in actual fact, it's an issue on both sides of having difficulty understanding the other side. So this is important for us in thinking about emotions and strong emotions and behaviors, because as we were talking about earlier, autistic people do not lack empathy, but they do experience the world and express emotions very differently to non-autistic people. And we're going to talk about this more throughout this webinar. So this doesn't mean that autistic people don't have emotions or empathy, but it does make it difficult for non-autistic people to understand and to empathize with autistic people, and vice versa. So this disconnect, it's known as a double problem because both sides experience a lack of understanding for the other group. So the next section is about overwhelm, meltdowns, and shutdowns. So to start with, how and why does overwhelm happen? So children who experience the world differently, so children with a different neurotype or a different way that their brain is connected or functions, they are more likely to experience higher levels of stress. And this is because they are functioning and living and studying, being educated in environments that are likely not designed to match their neurotype or to match their communication or engagement preferences or how they go about doing those things. And that can be stressful. So this stress can accumulate over a period of time. So sometimes it can be hours, sometimes it's days, it can even be weeks. And the stress can come from having different sensory processing experiences and difficulties meeting your own sensory demands. So that's known as sensory regulation. Communicating differently to those people around you, or something unexpected happening and not being prepared for that or not understanding that that's going to happen. So overwhelm can also happen where demands might exceed our capacity to respond to them. So demands or expectations being placed upon a child can sometimes exceed the skills or capacity that they have to respond adaptively. So in thinking about demands exceeding our capacity to respond, we also need to think about whether there are any avoidable demands when we're thinking about our own children and young people. So if we know that demands increase capacity, it's always a good idea to try and reduce the ones that are avoidable. So consider all of the situations where your child is being exposed to demands. So for example, there could be sensory demands at the swimming pool, or there could be interaction demands in the supermarket. So a demand really is where a person is having to tolerate something. So it could be through their sensory information, or it could be because somebody wants to interact or talk with them, or it could be because they're expected to behave in a certain way in a certain environment. Those are all demands that are placed upon us. And for lots of people, they're able to meet those demands and are okay to cope with them. But for some children who think and experience the world differently, those demands can be too much beyond their capacity to respond to them. So think about how many demands are in your child's life and how many of those are necessary or really, really required. So if your child can engage in this with you, help them to think about what they're able for and what they can tolerate, what they can cope with, and what's too much. And if your child isn't able to sit and do that with you, then you can do that for them by thinking about what their needs are. Executive functioning is also another important area to think about when we're thinking about why emotions might become overwhelming. And this is related to that frontal lobe section of the brain I mentioned earlier, that red part in the graph that we looked at. So it's the front area of your brain, and this area is responsible for executive functioning. So what executive functioning is it's like the management system of the brain. It is responsible for our ability to regulate, to manage, and control our thoughts and our actions. So we use our executive functioning to select and monitor our behaviors in order to reach a goal. So where we want to achieve something, we need to regulate ourselves to get there. And this is a really important aspect of maintaining emotions or managing emotions. So the 8 executive functions, so these are all the things that are part of executive functioning. So we've got self-control, which is the ability to stop and think before acting. We've got self-monitoring, which is the ability to view and evaluate yourself. We've got emotional control, which is the ability to manage feelings to achieve goals and complete tasks. We've got flexibility, which is the ability to adapt and change conditions by revising plans or changing strategies. Task initiation, so starting and finishing tasks without procrastinating or getting distracted. Organization, the ability to develop and use systems to keep track of our materials and the information that we have. So if you're doing a project or something. Working memory, which is the ability to use information held in your memory to complete a task. And then planning and time management, and that's the ability to create steps to reach a goal. So you can see how all of these things would be involved in managing emotions, managing overwhelm, regulating ourselves. And we know from what we spoke about earlier that for many people, of our young people who are thinking and experiencing the world differently, they have different connections within their brain, and quite often the areas within their brain that are responsible for some of these skills and abilities. So exactly as I just said, children and young people with developmental differences and with different neurotypes often find tasks and activities requiring executive functioning more challenging to do. Another area to consider then is the sensory area, so hypo or hypersensitivity, so either undersensitive or oversensitive to particular sensory information. So heightened sensory sensitivity increases the background stress levels, which increase emotional sensitivity. So dealing with too much sensory information or not having enough sensory stimulation can be very stressful for any of us. And this can make us more likely to experience stronger emotions. So meltdowns and shutdowns. So all of this overwhelm that we've been talking about up to now can result in what's known as a meltdown or a shutdown. And meltdowns and shutdowns can be extremely intense for an individual and utterly exhausting. So again, there is a video clip I'd like you to watch as part of understanding what we mean by meltdowns and shutdowns, particularly related to the autistic experience. So again, I had hoped to show this to you as part of the webinar, but unfortunately with technical difficulties at the moment, I'm unable to do that today. So I'd invite you to pause the webinar at this point and to go to YouTube and search for this video called Autistic Meltdowns and Overloads. What's that? And it's by a person who is on YouTube by the name of Agony Autie. The link is there, which you're unable to click on, but you can copy that into your browser either if that's preferable. And this is a picture below of the video that you're looking for. So a little bit more about what meltdowns are. Meltdowns are different to tantrums, as the intention of a tantrum is to get a response, whereas meltdowns actually are a response. So they are a response because what they are is an uncontrollable reaction to stress. So they are outside of the person's control, they are overwhelmed, overloaded, and they cannot tolerate anymore. So this is out of their control. Autistic people, particularly of any age, can have meltdowns. This is not just exclusive to children. Many autistic adults will experience a meltdown if they are overloaded and don't have an opportunity to regulate themselves. Meltdowns can look very different from person to person. They often include crying, screaming, stimming, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and a complete loss of control. It's really important that an autistic person should never be punished for having a meltdown. They are completely out of an autistic person's control, and therefore there's not anything that they can do about avoiding that behavior or that meltdown. Did you know that autism and meltdowns are related, obviously, but it's also important to think about the differences between meltdowns and tantrums. So these are a few facts by the Autism Dad who has this lovely website, theautismdad.com. So he's talking about autism being easily one of the most misunderstood of all the human conditions. And one of the most misunderstood things about autism is the meltdown. So these facts are really important. So meltdowns are not a disciplinary problem. They are not an indication of bad parenting, and they're also not an indication of a misbehaving child. They are not within a child's control. So what are they? Well, they are a result of overstimulation, and they are the body's way of purging. They are very common in autistic people, and they are very easily confused with tantrums. They can look very similar. So how do you know the difference between what a tantrum is or what's a meltdown? So again, what is a sensory meltdown? So a sensory meltdown or a meltdown are pretty much the same thing. So a meltdown happens when a child or an adult's sensory system becomes overwhelmed and they struggle to maintain control of themselves. Sensory meltdowns are very common in autistic people and those with sensory processing disorder also. And they aren't about attention. So sensory meltdowns happen when a person loses control. They are not done for attention. Whereas often tantrums can be thrown for the attention a child might get from their parents as a result, but that's not the case in a true sensory meltdown. So the way you know this is that a sensory meltdown will not stop when you give in. So when a child is having a tantrum and you give in to their demands, the tantrum will stop. But this is not the case with a sensory meltdown. So once a child or an adult even is in a meltdown, they've lost control and they need support to calm down and re-regulate. Sensory meltdowns can hurt. This is important to be aware of. So a child having a sensory meltdown may throw themselves to the floor, may hit their bodies or other people's bodies. They might throw things, whatever they can get their hands on, or show other painful behaviours. So keeping everybody safe is a real priority if your child is experiencing meltdowns. So to prevent a sensory meltdown is all about knowing what the triggers are. So different children will have different things that can trigger a meltdown. This could be from hunger to loud noises, and this can vary widely from child to child. So knowing what the triggers are will really help to prevent meltdowns. And as your child grows older, or if your child is an older young person or approaching adulthood, helping them to know themselves what their triggers are can really help to maintain that kind of even regulation. So shutdowns, and what are these? So shutdowns appear less intense than a meltdown, but can be equally debilitating for the person themselves. So these are also a response to being overwhelmed, but they might appear more passive. So for example, your child or your young person might go very quiet or switch off. Autistic people describe how it feels as though their mind is past a state of being able to interpret. And I have talked to autistic people who describe this as sometimes not being able to speak or communicate in any way because they are so overwhelmed. So signs and triggers to watch out for both meltdowns and shutdowns. So some of the triggers can be if a person is tired or hungry or uncomfortable or sick, if they are sensory overloaded, if they've had lots of transitions that are challenging for them, if there's too many new things and lots of uncertainty, if they're worried about how they're going to do a task or how they're going to complete something, if they're under pressure to socialize with other people, if there's unexpected change or unstructured social settings that aren't clear or certain. Some of the physical signs then that you might notice, you might see increased stimming, so that's self-stimulatory behaviour, and again we're going to talk about that later and what that is. There might be a change in someone's voice. There might be an increase in motor activity, so pacing up and down or moving about. There might increase repetitive actions, so hand or body movements. There might be a change in body language, facial expressions or posture. So one way of thinking about this is thinking about an overwhelm bucket. And I know that this talks here about autism and overwhelm, but really this is applicable to all of us. And if your child isn't autistic but has other developmental differences or differently wired neurotypes, this is also very relevant to them. So the same activities that can cause a meltdown one day may not have the same effect the next day. But why is this? So each activity that we do or stimulus that we come across adds to the bucket that we all carry around with us. Sometimes I like to think of this as a stress bucket either. So an overwhelm bucket or a stress bucket. So how much is it filling up? So stimuli might be something as simple as bright lights or background noise. And the things we enjoy can also be added to the bucket. So as each individual stimulus adds to the bucket, the water level begins to rise. And some activities that calm us, such as stimming or time alone, can help to empty the bucket before it overflows. So if things are being added to the bucket faster than it slowly empties, the bucket can overflow, and this is the meltdown. And as we said before, meltdowns are different for everyone, and it's really important for the person to have space and time to manage that and to re-regulate, because these are out of a person's control. So how do you support somebody who is experiencing a meltdown? So during a meltdown, your child's emotional system, or your child or anybody's emotional system and sensory system are dysregulated, or they're out of balance. So your instinct might be to hug or to hold your child, but this is often really unhelpful unless your child needs or wants deep pressure. For many people, when they're overwhelmed or they're experiencing a meltdown, touch can be additional stress, and it can have the opposite effect. So again, this is where it's important to be tuned into your own child's particular needs. For some children, deep pressure can be helpful when they're feeling overwhelmed. So the advised approach would be to hold back and give some space. Don't talk unless you have to, as talking can add demand and can further overwhelm the situation. Try not to take things personally that your child might say during a meltdown. Usually these aren't aimed at you, but they are part of the eruption, part of the overwhelm. That can be very difficult if there is a lot of personal things being thrown at you, but try to take a step back and to see them as part of the meltdown as opposed to things that your child really means. Remove other people from the situation. So try not to move your child unless you have to, as you will have to touch them or engage with them to do so, and this can actually escalate things further. And then allow them some space and time to come down as they need to. This is where they are going to be most vulnerable. And at this point, they need to know that they are loved, that everything is okay. And it's important to allow them to do whatever they need to do to re-regulate themselves. So after a meltdown, your child will likely feel exhausted. They might not remember what has happened, and they'll possibly feel a sense of shame, or they might say unkind things about themselves. So try to keep sensory information minimal after a meltdown and offer sensory input that you know they find calming and safe. If they want to engage in particular interests or to hyper-focus on something after a meltdown, then it's really important to allow them to do that. After a meltdown, your child or your young person or even an adult, they need reassurance and validation and safety, and you need that too. Watch for re-triggers when your child is coming the way down. It's very easy to go back up again when they're in the state of come down after a meltdown. And wait until later to talk with your child about what might have triggered their meltdown. So as they're recovering, that's not the time to start exploring things, because you risk the re-trigger and for things to go back up again rather than calming things down. So wait until a later time to talk it over. So, supporting self regulation overall. So, thinking back to our UPR framework, this is the P part. So, how do we prevent getting to that point of meltdown in the first place? So, how can we help with self regulation? So, regulation means keeping your child's sensory needs balanced, not giving too much or too little stimulation through their senses. Self-regulation involves understanding your own sensory system, and dysregulation, so if our regulation system is out of balance, can lead to emotional overwhelm, as we've talked about already. Some of our children and young people will need you as parents to help them to self-regulate. And if you don't understand your child's sensory system, it's harder to help them self-regulate. So it's really important to spend a little bit of time thinking about what your child's sensory needs are, what they can tolerate, and what they find difficult to tolerate. Learning about your child's sensory system is really important. So, as I said just a moment ago, to identify the things that they find difficult to tolerate and to identify the things that are calming and soothing. Recognizing sensory triggers for your child, and also really important to, when you're visiting places, to have an escape route. So should your child become overwhelmed, that you know how to leave, you know what that plan is, who's going to go with them, because staying is likely going to lead to overwhelm and a meltdown. Some places can be more triggering than others. So, for example, shops have a huge amount of sensory information, interaction, expectations, lots of demands. So, think about the different places where your child is and what the demands are, and whether they're more triggering for your child than other places. Be aware of this buildup of stress over time. So remember the bucket and the bucket filling up, and if we don't empty that out, that's going to keep building up. Your child might appear to successfully tolerate an environment on one occasion, but in doing that, they may have had to suppress their discomfort. So don't assume that just because your child was fine visiting the swimming pool 1 week, or appeared to be fine visiting the swimming pool, that's not going to be the case the next time. It could be very different the next time, depending on how full their bucket might be and how much opportunity they've had to empty out their buckets of stress by regulating themselves, by doing calm and comforting activities. And also in being in an environment that is difficult for them to tolerate, be aware that you are adding to their bucket, and they might be trying to suppress their discomfort, which can be harmful for them. So by repeatedly putting your child in uncomfortable sensory environments, we might be unintentionally contributing to that buildup of stress. So stimming and self-stimulatory behavior, what is this and what does this mean? So stimming is short for self-stimulatory behavior, and it might refer to particular hand movements or body movements or vocalizations. Often these are repeated, but it's not just about repetitive movements. Stimming is also a form of communication. Stimming really helps with self-regulation and with processing information, so it's a really important tool that you have to support your child. Stimming can be the best form of regulation, and all of us all of us engage in stimming behaviors. So for example, biting your nails, playing with your hair, tapping a pen could all be considered examples of stimming. Lots of us gesture really strongly with our hands when we're talking, and that is a form of stimming where that's helping us to process what we're trying to say. Some people stim in more obvious ways than others, so spinning or dancing or flapping hands, pacing or rocking. All of these are forms of stimming, self-stimulatory behavior. So stimming is a protective response to overstimulation. So it helps often autistic children, but also other non-autistic children or children who have other developmental differences too. It helps to block excess sensory inputs when we're overwhelmed. So when their stress bucket is really full up, stimming can help to block it from getting even further full up. It can reduce the overall sensation of pain, although some stims can themselves cause pain, so just to be aware of that. Um, it can also be a way of getting extra sensory input if there is understimulation. So if your child is understimulated, they will be just as out of balance as if they are overstimulated. So sometimes stimming can help them to get a little bit more input and help them to feel calm. Stimming helps to manage emotions that might be intense or hurtful to a child, and it helps them to soothe themselves when they are distressed. Preventing stimming really causes harm unless the person is actively hurting themselves with the stimming that they're engaging in. And it is highly, highly stressful for a person not to be allowed to stim. You'll hear this if you listen to autistic people talking about this. If they're verbal and they're communicating, not being allowed to stim is absolutely really difficult for autistic people. And this can lead to masking. A need to do this. So masking is hiding a behavior that is not harmful but is deemed to be socially unacceptable by others. Stimming is a real vulnerable example of this because lots of autistic people are often given the message by society that their stimming is not okay or doesn't look right. And we know that hiding that or not doing that is stressful and harmful for the person, but they can often feel very conflicted by that because they need to do it, but they're not able to do it within society. So it's really important to be aware of masking. As I said there, masking is hugely harmful for autistic people and can lead to autistic burnout and even trauma. So a way of thinking about it is a stim might indicate there is a problem, might indicate, as I said earlier, it's not always an indication that someone's overwhelmed. Sometimes it's just a way of regulating themselves. So it might indicate that there is a problem, but it is not the problem. So other things that can help with regulation are routine and predictability are really important. So routines and consistency increase predictability, so therefore children may feel like they have more control and feel safer as a result. And this can really help to bring down somebody's anxiety, knowing what's happening next. And bearing in mind that lots of our children communicate differently, they don't always communicate verbally, and they don't always understand our verbal communication. So how do we let them know what the routine is or what's happening next? That's really important to think about. Emotions and particular interests are also another way of supporting somebody's regulation. So this person talked about how what they said was my emotional range is quite extreme and somewhat rudimentary. However, when I engage in my special interest on my own, I can access a greater emotional realm and landscape that is safe for me. So it's really important for people to engage in their passions, what their hobbies are, what their interests are. And it's really important to nurture that particular interest and to support your child or young person to find a place for it in their life. And I suppose we're saying this bearing in mind that many people's interests might not be what's typical for their age, or it might be related to objects or facts about things, or it might be, things related to historical events. It could be anything, but it's okay and really important to nurture that and find a place for it. Because having a particular interest or a strong passion for something is really valuable to autistic people, but also to non-autistic people. It builds self-confidence, it assists with coping with emotions, and gives that feeling of enrichment. So this person, Autumn Van Kirk, talked about this in an article called The Benefits of Special Interests in Autism. So this is available on the web if anybody wants to read further about it. But Autumn spoke about how our special interests are the air that we breathe. When we're engaged in special interests, we're living our best lives. Quite often for many autistic people, what their special interests are when they're younger, their particular things that they're passionate about, can turn into careers when they're older. And quite often they have a very strong ability to be able to engage in what they're interested in for long periods of time, which can quite often mean that they can have the potential to be incredibly successful in their career path. So just to bear that in mind. So we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about a regulation toolbox. So what is a regulation toolbox? A regulation toolbox is a virtual box, so it's an imaginary box that we have, filled with strategies to help your child to manage their sensory and emotional needs. So the strategies or the tools in the box are things that your child might find helpful when they experience anxiety or anger or other emotions, and they can help to avoid leading to the meltdown. So each person's toolbox will be unique to them, and it can be helpful to make a visual representation, so through drawings or photographs, or it could even be objects, of the strategies in the toolbox that your child finds helpful. So this can help them to remember what can help them out if they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So what are some ideas for the tools? So in terms of physical tools, these are really important because they're important for well-being and for energy, and they're important tools for self-regulation. So some of you might be familiar with Go Noodle, which is used by a lot of schools for movement breaks and giving activities for different breaks. So that's one avenue you could go if you're looking for some ideas around some of these physical tools for self-regulation. Or any other daily physical exercise which will improve mood and clarity of thought. So anything that your child enjoys, it could be walking or cycling, could be swimming, it could be, going up and down the stairs, it could be trampolining, all of those things can be really helpful. Emotional tools. So these are tools that increase our understanding of ourselves. So these might be things like mindfulness or tuning into our bodily sensations. So what does my body feel like when I'm angry? That can be a way of knowing if I'm angry, tuning into how my body feels. Or you can use things like mood scales or thermometers to help your child learn about different shades or different levels of anger or strong emotions. Pleasure tools are really important as well, related to what we were talking about earlier about particular interests or strong passions that your child might have. So doing something you have enjoyed in the past often really helps us to feel better. So hobbies, interests, particular passions, all of these things really help to keep anxiety under control, and they block us from thinking about things that maybe are more negative or challenging. So you can do things like creating a pleasure diary or having a choice board around different things that your child really loves. Relaxation tools then are really important as well. So this could be things like time in nature, solitude, so just having a little bit of quiet time is really important, particularly for autistic children, massage or deep pressure. And then also being with animals can be very calming, and there's a lot of research to support this, that being with animals and stroking animals or pets can be very calming. And for children who experience the world differently or have different neurotypes, there is a lot of sensory feedback that they can get from being with an animal as well, which can be really supportive to their regulation. Sensory care for sensory overload. So again, coming back to thinking about what particularly helps for your child. What do they find calming? What do they find soothing? So some ideas are here in relation to things like noise cancelling headphones if they are in environments that have lots of noise that they find difficult to tolerate. It could be nature sounds like rain, storms or sunny days, sleeping masks for darkness, when they are going to sleep, nature scenes or ambient noise, and you can get these on YouTube or Spotify. Scents that your child enjoys, so different smells. Changing the temperature to warmer or cooler, so sometimes if they're too hot or too cold. Soft or low lighting, guided meditations can help, or different rhythmical beats can be really soothing for lots of people. So some of those African chants, or sometimes even some of the religious chants, can be really calming and soothing for lots of people. And then weighted, soft or heated blankets can also be a good idea. So think of all of these things. And there are other things outside of what's on this slide that would be helpful for your own child. Thinking tools then. So working on how we think about things, our perception of things, which can help us to work on our reactions to things. So think about your child's intellectual ability and where they're at in terms of their learning style, and think about how you could use this to help them to analyze their feelings. So there are a number of different books that you can get that help with these things. So Starving the Anger Gremlin is one that's tried and tested. A Volcano in My Tummy is another one. And these are really good tools if your child is at a stage where they can engage with some of those things. Social tools then are another tool for the toolbox. And I suppose be aware that as is the case with all of these different tools, but particularly with social tools, these can be very nurturing and energizing for your child, but can also be a demand and can be difficult for them to tolerate if it's not the right environment or situation. So be careful with this one that you're not increasing their stress accidentally or unintentionally. So some of these social tools might be things like having time with a family member or a peer, a friend. And again, think about supporting your child to meet and develop relationships with like-minded friends. So maybe somebody who's interested in the same particular hobby that they have, or a particular interest that they might have, that can sometimes work really well if they like to talk about something in particular. So finding a friend who likes to do that too can be a good idea. Being with a pet, we've talked about already, and again, there's a huge social aspect to being with pets, and often pets are less demanding than humans are for lots of our children and young people. So it can be much easier to tolerate being with a pet, and can be a lot more rewarding where there is less demand. It could be things like completing acts of kindness for other people, or trying out a new social activity. But again, be aware that that's not creating a demand for your child. So we're going to focus in the next section a little bit about teaching self-advocacy. So why is self-advocacy important? So this involves making your own decision about what you need and communicating this to others. And developing this skill can really help to support your child's ability to regulate themselves. So if they are able to communicate to other people in whatever way that they can, or whatever their preference is around communication, what they need to regulate themselves, this can be a really helpful thing, particularly in school. So what does your child need to self-advocate about? Well, typically self-advocating is in relation to their communication, so what they need in terms of communicating with others, how they want to engage with others, if they need to stop engaging for a moment to re-regulate themselves, to empty their stress bucket a little bit, and also in relation to sensory needs. So these are often the most helpful areas to work on self-advocacy around. So some examples of statements to learn might include things like, don't worry if I don't make eye contact, I am still listening, or I need to take a break. So again, these might be things that might be helpful for them to be able to communicate in school. And this can be communicated visually as well as verbally. So there's more information about teaching self-advocacy on this website, autisticSLT.com. Parent self-care is the next section we're going to focus on, and this is a really important area when we're thinking about supporting emotions and behaviours that might be associated with really strong emotions. So the first thing to say is the context for this. So I suppose it's really important to remember that when we're thinking about behavior, we're really, what we're saying is that my child is not giving me a hard time. My child is having a hard time. So trying to reframe it a little bit for yourself can be really helpful in being kind to yourself and being kind to your child in terms of what their needs are. So often it can feel as though they're doing things or directing things on purpose to us. But try and take a step back and look at it differently in terms of them actually having a hard time, rather than them giving you a hard time. So within this, then, we've got to think of the power of parents. So it's really important to remember that you are the expert on your own child. Nobody knows them the way that you know them. Nobody knows the detail of what works and what doesn't work better than you do. And professionals, we can have knowledge and skills that are helpful, but we will never know your particular child the way that you know them. So because of that, then therapeutic sessions, so where you might come in for, to meet with a psychologist or an SLT or an OT for an hour a week, can be limited in their effectiveness because they're too spread out and it's too time limited. So what can be more helpful is that day-to-day support. So getting the advice and the support from professionals, but implementing that every day is what's most helpful. So it's really important to build up support and accommodations into your child's daily life. So parent self-care, why is this important? And there's a lovely image there on the top right, which we often talk about when we're talking about this with parents, about how they tell us all the time on airplanes, if we need to put our masks on, we must put our own mask on first before we help anybody around us. And this is so true for when we're parenting, regardless of what your child's needs are or what their preferences are or what's going on for them, it is so important that we are looking after ourselves in order to be able to look after them. So why is this important? Well, if you are stressed or tired, you're usually not the parent that you want to be. And that is true for all of us. Whenever any of us are stressed or tired, we are more likely to be overwhelmed, to be snappy with our family, to be not as tolerant as we usually would be. And while there is not much we can do about the challenges that come our way sometimes, we can build our ability to better respond to these challenges when they arrive. So this is really important because it's really about sustaining yourself along the parenting journey. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and keeping yourself going is really important. And again, I can't stress enough that this applies to every single parent. But also particularly if your child is experiencing the world differently, there might be additional stressors for you then. So it's really important that you're looking after yourself as best you can as well. So it's important to model that good balance and healthy boundaries to you, your child, and to your family. And be really mindful of tending to your own sensory needs and your own regulation needs. We've talked a lot about supporting your child, but these supports and needs are just as much important for you as a parent as they are for your child. And this can be really challenging when your own sensory needs might be different to your child, particularly if you are also autistic and your child is too, and you have different sensory needs to them. So some we've often come across families where a parent might really need quiet and calm in order to regulate themselves, whereas their child needs lots of rhythmical beats and music and loud noise to feel stimulated and regulated. So managing those competing needs within a household is really important, and think about how you can achieve that for everybody, because one person not being balanced is going to upset the whole house. That's going to have an impact for everybody. So our final part of the webinar is about accessing information and where you can go to get reliable, good information. So firstly, in terms of some websites, so there's lots of really good websites out there. So Ireland's National Autism Charity is As I Am, and they have a website which is really good, and they are strongly working to create a society in which every autistic person is empowered to reach their own potential and to fully participate in society. They're doing a massive amount of work at the moment, lots of work with schools as well to create better, or not better, but more accommodating mainstream environments, particularly to support everybody's needs, whether you've got a different neurotype or not. And then the Middletown Centre for Autism is also helpful. They offer a range of free training events for parents and for teachers and professionals. There's also the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and they have a publication for parents which is called Start Here, a guide for parents of autistic kids. Neuroclastic is a really good website as well, the autism spectrum according to autistic people. So this was written by the autistic community, all the different things that you might need to know about autism and current ways of thinking about autism. So that's really good. And then the Thinking Person's Guide to Neurodiversity is really helpful as well, about how we understand neurodiversity and different neurotypes. Some books then that can be really helpful. So some books for parents. There is a learning app guide to autism. Not so much a book. I should have put this in the other section of websites, but it's really good. The learning app guide to autism and education, and the website is there. So some books that are helpful are things like No More Meltdowns by Jed Baker and The Explosive Child by Ross Green. So this little image there of what these two books look like, if you are looking out for them in the shops or anything like that, or your library can order in any of these books for you as well. Books for younger children then that can be helpful. Pete the Cat and His Magic Sunglasses is one which is about helping your child to identify emotions. So this can be particularly helpful if you think your child experiences alexithymia, so not being able to identify their emotions, and you want to try and support them with that. What Were You Thinking is another book by Brian Smith, and this is all about controlling impulses and managing anger. And then The Panicosaurus is another tried and tested one. So this is about managing anxiety in children, including autistic children also. Few others then for younger children. The Kid's Guide to Staying Awesome and in Control, Simple Stuff to Help Children Regulate Their Emotions and Senses by Lauren Bruckner is a good one. And then also The Parent's Practical Guide to Resilience for Children aged 2 to 10 on the autism spectrum by Jeanette Purkis and Emma Goodall. Jeanette Purkis is an autistic author. I'm not sure about Emma Goodall, but definitely Jeanette Purkis has written a lot, and her books are really good. For teens, then there's a few different books as well that are helpful. So Know Your Spectrum, an autism creative writing workbook for teens by Finn Monaghan. So this book is written to support autistic teenagers to find out about themselves and to work out their individual spectrum of autism. So to figure out what works well for them, what's not so helpful, and it's done quite creatively. So it's a lovely book actually. The next one is The Parent's Practical Guide to Resilience for Preteens and Teenagers on the Autism Spectrum. So this is just the follow-on book by Jeanette Purkis and Emma Goodall, so for preteens and teenagers, whereas the other one was for 2 to 10-year-olds. And then the last one on the slide there is The Teen Guide to Sensory Issues by Rachel Scheider, which is a good one as well. So some final thoughts for this, just one last slide, just a little bit about the importance of connecting with the autistic community if your child is autistic or if you and your child are autistic. So really just to emphasize how important it is and not to underestimate the importance of it, of your child linking with other autistic children and of you linking with other parents of autistic children. And Kieran Rose, who tweets as the Autistic Advocate, he is an autistic dad himself. He's autistic and I think he's 3 children who are all autistic too. And he writes and tweets a lot about autism and autistic related issues. So he sums it up really well when he says, "How have I benefited from connecting with autistic people? Validation of relatable experience, identifiable, recognizable neuroculture, friendship, connection, shared knowledge, shared interests, shared monotropic experience and learning styles, and the feeling of being home." And I think that just really sums it up. And I think when we're managing strong emotions and dealing with strong behaviors within our children, it can feel like you're the only person who is managing these things, and it can feel really difficult to take a step back and try and see how to move forward. And I think part of linking with the autistic community and connecting in with that community is really about that shared experience, and as Kieran talks about, that feeling of being home and being understood. So that's the end of our webinar workshop today. Many thanks for your time and for your attention in watching this. I hope that it was helpful, and we look forward to meeting with you or seeing you again at another workshop soon. Bye for now.